I want to talk a little bit about McPhail Chapter 3 and go through some highlights that I think are important for you to understand. The first thing I want to bring out something, and that is to find out if you've picked up on something. You've only read 3 chapters of McPhail, but you should be picking on something right now, and that is he concentrates mostly on broadcast media, mostly television. He does mention wire services. There's almost no mention of other types of print media, newspapers or magazines. And he can be faulted for that, I think, because I think newspapers do play a very important role. But on the other hand, broadcasting is an enormously powerful medium. And unlike newspapers, it is very easy to distribute a broadcast signal, either a terrestrial signal from a television tower or a satellite signal that comes down through a dish mounted on top of a building. So television very easily crosses borders. It's relatively inexpensive to do. Television, you can do it on the cheap. It doesn't look very good, but you can do it. You can receive radio tremendously. I mean, for just pennies, you can receive radio. A radio receiver, a little radio, costs almost nothing. Televisions do, and that causes a problem. But small portable radios cost almost nothing. They're portable. They use a battery. They're easily accessible. And it doesn't require as much literacy. Newspapers, of course, require the ability to read, and to read at a certain level and a certain comprehension level. So that's one of the reasons that I think McPhail concentrates so much on television. Television is and broadcasting, radio and television. But the broadcast media are, in many parts of the world, the most powerful and the most influential. A few moments ago, I said the word access. It's easy to access a radio signal. And I want to talk for a moment about 2 different meanings of the word access. And for anybody in any area of international relations, international studies, global communication, or political science, or whatever area that you plan to go into, this is an important term, this word access, and the dual meaning of the word access. First, it's access to. In other words, can you get your hands on a radio signal, a radio program, a newspaper, a book, or something like that? And the answer for most of us is yes, we can. Most of us around the globe, and even in very remote areas, are able to access a media message of some sort. It may be a propagandistic message, it may be a health message, whatever it might be. Many people do have access to certain media, one or more. But the second meaning of the word access is maybe I think it's as important as the first definition. And that is, do you have access so that you can get your story into the media? Can you see your concerns expressed in the media? Can you see stories that cover issues that you are consumed with into the media? When the media portray your country, how is your country portrayed? Is it portrayed by journalists who come in, drop down, do a quick story, and leave? Or are they done by people who live in your community, who know the nuances of your culture, your people, your situation, your economics, your politics, all of those things, and write stories from that perspective? Can you get your story into the media? And that is an extremely important aspect of the word access. And that was really one of the things behind the effort for the New World Information and Communication Order. The book's discussion is important. Look at the background, but as you read through it, there's a very important question to ask yourself, and that is, did UNESCO, which was the United Nations platform for creating the NWICO, did it intentionally set out to subvert, thwart, whatever word you want to say? Did it intend to infringe on freedom of the press? My personal opinion is no, it did not. But it sort of turned out that way, or at least it was going that way. So on page 51, right at the bottom, I think it's the last sentence on that page, it's talking about the non-aligned nations, the nations that weren't aligned either back in the 1960s in the midst of the Cold War. You were either a Western nation or a Soviet-influenced nation. And then there was a whole bunch of non-aligned nations that didn't align themselves with either one or the other. And it was their objections. They had a number of objections to the way media were being propagated throughout the world. And at the very bottom of that page, there's a sentence that talks about what research revealed, and I talked about it in the first lecture, and that's this one-way flow of information. And the messages we create here in the West are those products, those one-way flow of information products. And that one-way flow is exactly what I was talking about. You can get that message, but you can't get your message into that flow. There's no reverse flow back out from your small peripheral country. So the peripheral nations had three objections to the media back in the 60s and the 70s. And one is simply an anti-capitalist approach. They didn't like the commercial aspect, the fact that they were being exploited as an audience for advertisers, or they didn't like having to pay for it, whichever it was. Usually it's simply the commercial aspects. They didn't like the advertising that went along with the programs that they were getting. They didn't like the one-way flow of information from the U.S. to them with little or any reciprocal trade. That, by the way, what they also didn't like, there was a one-way flow of dollars, one-way flow of revenue, and the revenue was out of their country and not back into the country. So if you want to muddy the water a little bit, there's this one-way flow of information, and then there's a reverse one-way flow of revenue. And the revenue was making the Western countries, supplying the programs and the hardware in the form of transmitters, televisions, radios, all of the hardware necessary to propagate media messages. All of that money was flowing out of their countries and back into the Western countries. And then, of course, they didn't like many of the cultural aspects. There were religious differences, there were sexual differences, there were food differences. There were a number of things, the cultural aspects that they didn't like, and so those were their objections. And so this New World Information and Communication Order, which I talked about on the other slideshow, was drafted, and it said that countries, as I mentioned, countries get to control their own image, and they also get to control the flow of information out of their country. Usually, when foreign media back in the day would go into a country, they would have to microwave or somehow get their reports out, and they would have to use, in general, government-owned satellite systems or telephone systems to get their message back to their organizations. And the country said, look, we have a right to, censor this to make sure that it doesn't make us look bad. Well, that is censorship, and the Western nations truly objected to that. It's less of a problem these days because many places you can go in and use a satellite phone. Now, some countries do restrict the use of satellite phones and satellite transmitting devices, portable devices, and if they catch you, you're in big trouble. So there still is that potential conflict. The compromise that was reached eventually favored freedom of the press, and in effect, the Western nations won that. The implication for access, that aspect of access that means can you get your story into the medium, is that just about anybody can get the messages, but many cannot gain access. They don't see their stories, they don't see their countries reflected in a way that is favorable to their countries. because the only time the Western news media will go into a country, a small peripheral country, I've mentioned this before, is when there's bad news. When there's good news, you're off the radar screen as far as the Western nations are concerned. And so when there's bad news is when we see the country, and that's all we see about your tiny little country. It's bad news. And of course, that creates an impression of your country that isn't good. If you're looking for people to invest in industries, if you're looking for people to come in and help with certain social efforts or things like that, and there is nothing but negative news about your country, you're less likely to get that sort of help that you're looking for, because we do end up with a distorted view of many nations and many people within those nations. If you think about the Ebola outbreak, how much had you heard about some of those countries before that outbreak? Almost, I can guarantee, probably not at all. And all we know about it is that they have a terrible healthcare system. Well, that's the message we got because they were in the midst of an outbreak. People have lived there for thousands and thousands of years. And there are health problems, and there are things like that, but it is not as negative, I'm guessing, as the reports that we had during the Ebola outbreak tell us. So that's what I wanted you to kind of get out of that chapter. That's highlighting, there's much more of that. If I can go on to one further thing, it is that those of you who are interested in international relations especially, go ahead and read chapter 4 just, for your own enjoyment, if you will. There's a lot in there about the role of global media communication in the diplomacy process, and I think it would be interesting to you to look at that when you have a chance. I'll also mention that on the Blackboard page, under course materials and the reading tab, scroll down to the readings tab, there are a number of readings in there that are not assigned. I've put them in there because some of them may appeal to a few of you, and I would urge you, to glance at them. They're mostly journal articles, and some popular media articles, but not many. The one that's fascinating is the one on Old Oman from a 1911 edition of National Geographic, and you really should read that. It's very short. It's fun to read, and you'll be able to draw some interesting contrasts. Thanks for listening. I'll see you soon.